In this lecture, we are going to discuss enforcement and data breaches under the GDPR. With regards to enforcement, we're going to talk about the complaint process, liability and compensation, and fines. And with regards to data breaches, we will provide a definition for data breaches and then talk about data breach notifications. If an individual or organization feels that their rights under the GDPR have been violated, they may initiate a complaint. A complaint may be initiated by a data subject or a DPA. A data subject may file a complaint to a member state court where the issue occurred or at their place of residence or work. Now, under certain circumstances, a DPA may file a complaint on behalf of a subject. Under these circumstances, if the data subject is dissatisfied with the DPA, the data subject themselves may bring the complaint to their member state court when, as I said, they are unsatisfied with the DPA, or if there is no resolution within 3 months. With regards to liability and compensation, data processors and controllers are both accountable and liable. Now, there are some circumstances when only the controller or only the processor may be liable. A controller is liable for unlawful processing, and a processor is liable when violating controller instructions. Of course, if both are involved in unlawful processing, then they're both liable. Now, once a data subject has been compensated, the controller and processor may go after each other as necessary. So if the data controller feels that the processor is liable, then once the subject is compensated, the controller can separately go after the processor and vice versa. If there are two controllers, that is, there are joint controllers, then both are held liable. Data controllers and processors may be exempt from liability under situations when neither are in any way responsible for the harm. An example of this might be a cyber attack. If during the forensics process, law enforcement or whoever is responsible for the investigation determines that the controllers and processors were doing everything correctly, maybe a 0 day was used to execute the cyber attack, then under those circumstances, neither the controller nor processor would be liable. Fines can be quite high under the GDPR. A high fine can be up to 4% of global revenue. That's right, 4% of global revenue. And examples of high violations include infringing on consent or rights, unlawful processing, and the unlawful transfer of data outside of the EU. Low fines are up to 2% of global revenue. And examples include infringing on data protection by default or by design, inadequate records management, DPA cooperation, or not having a designated DPO, and poor cybersecurity or breach notification. Under the GDPR, criminal sanctions are also possible. You definitely want to remember both of these percentages here: high violation up to 4% and low violation up to 2%. What is a data breach? The definition is as follows: a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. When there is a data breach, controllers are required to report that breach to a DPA within 72 hours of being aware. The 72 hours is important. Make sure you remember that. Data breach reporting is not required if the breach is unlikely to impact individuals' rights and freedoms. As for processors, if they suffer a data breach, they must notify the controller without undue delay. Finally, we're going to look at data subject notification. When there is a data breach, notification must be in clear and plain language. It must state the name of the data protection officer and their contact information. The notification must state the likely consequences of the breach and also state the mitigations that are being implemented. There are 3 situations where data controllers are not required to provide breach notification. If there is low risk of harm, for example, the data has been encrypted, then the controller need not provide notification. If the data controller is taking steps to protect the data subject, for example, by closing their accounts, then there's no need to provide notification. And finally, if providing breach notification would create both an unreasonable burden and public notice is already given, for example, through the media, then the data controller is not required to provide breach notification. In this lecture, we have gone over GDPR enforcement and breach notification. We discussed the complaint process. Under what situations would a data subject initiate a complaint, and under what circumstances might a DPA do that for them. With regards to liability and compensation, we mentioned that controllers and processors are accountable to the subject and to each other, and under certain circumstances, controllers and processors may be exempt from liability. For example, if neither were in any way responsible for the harm. And the example we looked at was that of a zero-day attack. You need to remember the high and low level fines, which are 4% and 2% respectively. You need to know the definition of a data breach. And as we see here, a data breach is a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. With regards to required breach notification under the GDPR, remember that controllers must report within 72 hours to the DPA, and that controllers are exempt if the breach is unlikely to impact the rights and freedoms of data subjects. Processors, on the other hand, must always report the breach to the controller without undue delay. And finally, data subject notification with regards to breaches must be in clear and plain language. It must include the DPO's name and contact information, the likely consequences of the breach, the mitigations being implemented, and finally, you'll want to remember the controller exemptions. Under what circumstances would a controller not be required to provide data subjects with breach notification?